Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and Entertaining series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project. More specifically, in this instance, the work in progress Nintendo 64 core. I say work in progress only because Robert FPGAZumSpass felt like having some fun at Christmas, and he's updated both the stock core as well as the turbo core with some test versions, improving a few bugs and getting a little bit more performance out of the builds. Just be aware that this is not currently on update all. If you want these, you got to go over to the MiSTer FPGA Discord, go into the Nintendo 64 channel, and hit up the pin. So it will be manual install until these things are verified, and the turbo core is always going to be manual install. It's never going to come down with update all just before you ask that question, but it's absolutely fun just to get one more core before the holidays. And even if Robert won't admit it, I feel like this is maybe a bit of a meme. Last year he promised one game playable by Christmas 2023, and we had the entirety of the library minus one game playable by Christmas. So I feel like this is his little jab and nod, just saying there's a little bit more fun to have this holiday season. Before I get too far involved though, it'd be a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. Now, where there are a few lingering bugs in the core that Robert's trying to patch up here, and also this involves how you actually build the core. If you go into Quartus and try to get builds out, there's different timings and different efficiencies. Basically, every build is a little bit of a variable. You may have to build the core 10, 20, 30, 50, even 100 times to see which best build is going to be out there. It comes down to a lot of the routing of the actual logic on the FPGA chip. It is not a static thing, it's actually a moving target, and each build will try to route things a little bit differently. And I know a lot of people don't actually know how the sausage gets made, for lack of a better term, on FPGA, especially on MiSTer, but building these things is very CPU intensive. It can take a long time to get a great build, and that's what we are testing here. And I would say anecdotally, some of the games that see improvements on the turbo core see maybe 1 or 2 more frames per second. Turok 2 here, especially the intro area, feels just a little bit smoother and a little bit nicer to play on the new turbo core than it did on the previous one. Now, of course, this is not going to make every single game run at a locked 60 frames per second, and I do have some more turbo tests coming up later this month in the beginning of 2025, so you can see really what you're getting out of it. But any more efficiencies in Nintendo 64 are always going to be welcome, because the later games, especially the ones that ran in high-res mode, could absolutely be slideshows on real hardware. You'll see here with the pseudo real-time lighting effect, the frame rate is coming up better than it usually is. You're probably averaging maybe 10 to 12 more frames per second in something like Turok 2 on the turbo core than you ever would have seen on a stock Nintendo 64, and this is definitely a game that needs as many extra frames as possible, otherwise it definitely feels a little bit like a slideshow. But that's one of the things about the turbo core and even the stock core, they can be more efficient than a real Nintendo 64. Now, additionally, there was one bug in Resident Evil 2 that was very hard to actually find. You basically had to do things in a certain way, because there would be a texture glitch where the wrong texture would load up for a few seconds in one of the scenes where a zombie busts through the wall. Now, in the current core, that has been taken care of, and that's always fun. You're not really going to see any other improvements in Resident Evil 2. It isn't a game that's going to benefit from the turbo core, but this was a game that took a long time to actually get perfectly running on the core with different patches, just trying to get some of the different access times adhering to what the Nintendo 64 would expect. But the last little bit of Resident Evil 2, that one texture glitch where the wrong thing would load up for a moment in time, seems to be taken care of in this build, giving you a perfect Resident Evil 2 experience. And it's not like anyone would actually mind if one texture loaded incorrectly for half a second then popped off screen, but that is the level of commitment and precision Robert's going for with this core, trying to make sure that every last little string has been tied up and everything is as good as it possibly can be. And that's always fun to see, and we really like to see it at Christmas. Gives you something to do over the holiday. But you tell me down below, what core are you playing the most in your holiday break? For me, probably definitely still going to be some Bomberman Hero on Nintendo 64. But let's move over to Body Harvest, another game that hugely benefits from the turbo core and has definitely seen some improvements here as well. It's also going to be your first sound sample because it has a very interesting intro cutscene and soundtrack. So go ahead and listen. I'll be right back with more games. Just some awesome music, but the reason I really use that intro cut sequence is that it's just running better than it ever has before and feels like it's getting to 60 frames in certain spots. Because Body Harvest was one of those games that was fully open world on the Nintendo 64, it could absolutely choke on its own frame rate at times. It was just too ambitious for the hardware, and that's something I feel like really did happen in the Nintendo 64 era. Developers wanted to be ambitious and make these big new experiences, and the Nintendo 64 was like 90% up to the task, but definitely that last 10% would kind of bottleneck the hardware, and you'd get situations where you'd have these really bad frame drops, especially in Body Harvest when you're fighting all of these bugs and the explosions went across the screen. It could just be a situation in which you kind of turn the game into a quasi slideshow. Now here on the Nintendo 64 Turbo Core, especially with the updates, it just feels like the smoothest experience you're going to have with a game like Body Harvest, and it is just such a fun and interesting game to play. Kind of feels like a precursor to something like Grand Theft Auto, fully 3D, fully open world. You have vehicles you can jump in and a lot of different goals to accomplish, and if you've never played it on Nintendo 64 before, I can't recommend it enough. Give it a shot. It's a ton of fun, and if you're going to play it, definitely play it on the Turbo Core, because again, you're just getting better performance here, and that is the great thing, because there are a decent amount of games on the hardware that could definitely use that performance boost, whether you're in high resolution mode and you want better frame rates, or even some of the games that just run in standard definition mode that have an unlocked frame rate, you're going to get better performance from it. And again, I do have some other demonstration videos coming up in the next couple of weeks to really explain this, so you can get a good sense of every single game you're going to see some benefits from. But Body Harvest is just one of those games. It is super fun, it's super interesting, really feels ahead of its time, both in the gameplay aspect as well as what I was asking of the Nintendo 64 hardware. And now here today, you're just going to get the best version of the game. And of course, because it does involve gigantic bugs, kind of feels a little bit like Starship Troopers mixed with a Godzilla game. And if you know anything about me, anytime I mention Godzilla, I tell you I do love a good kaiju battle, and this game kind of has that vibe to it. If you've ever played Earth Defense Force before, you're definitely going to like what's going on here, and I can't recommend enough. Definitely check this one out in the Turbo Core. But remember, both cores have been updated, just not posted to update all yet, and that is because every new core build does require some testing to make sure there's no regressions before it gets pushed to update all. Now moving over to Hybrid Heaven, I would say this is probably, for me personally, the most improved game as far as the Turbo Core is concerned, along with that high resolution mode. And I'm going to make a special video just on this one talking about the improvements and why it is one of the games that no one seems to play on Nintendo 64 and definitely should. And if that's not Kurt Russell there playing the president, I don't know who it is. But this is just the type of title, it's so intriguing, it's so interesting, and it kind of plays the story of how experimental the Nintendo 64 truly could be, because this game is a turn-based action role-playing game. Kind of feels like Metal Gear Solid if you had to actually queue up your moves, and it also has a very fun soundtrack, so this is your second soundtrack sample with a very cinematic cutscene, so enjoy. I think maybe that cutscene there that you just saw is the best use of an in-engine cutscene on the entirety of Nintendo 64. There's just something about the camera framing and the ability to tell a story without actually really using much audio whatsoever that just 100% works. And again, something like Hybrid Heaven is just such a unique experience. It really is unlike any other game from this generation, and I can't recommend it enough, and that's why I'm going to do a special video on this in a couple weeks talking about the game and how it is improved on the Nintendo 64 core. But that's the reality of the new cores, especially on Turbo. You're just going to get a better experience on top of what is already the best version of Nintendo 64 outside of playing an HDMI modded original console with a flash cart, and you definitely can't complain about that as a gift at Christmas. But that's the current situation with the current Nintendo 64 core. It is one of those things. Robert keeps improving it, and he decided to have a little fun at Christmas, so now definitely you have at least one game playable by Christmas. That was the meme back in 2023, and it is now Christmas 2024, and that just goes to show how long we've actually been talking about the development of the Nintendo 64 core. It's been an amazing wild ride. If anything else changes, I'll update the video, but we are done. Go play some new Nintendo 64 cores, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.